Our next speaker is Mr. Kurt Spalding, EPA Administrator for Region 1. Kurt has an extensive experience in the environmental protection field as an advocate, policy analyst, and administrator. Since joining the EPA leadership team in February 2010, he has been leading a holistic approach to finding environmental solutions in New England. He's emphasized efforts in community engagement, sustainability, environmental justice, and the green economy. Kurt has focused our efforts in the region on three cross-cutting initiatives on climate change, stormwater, and community prosperity.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, great pleasure to be before a Sea Grant audience. It seems like a short career, but I guess it's a couple decades. I have had the great pleasure to work with many of you, and it's great to be here. The other thing I want to say before I get into my remarks is you've just heard a talk from a state senator in Massachusetts. I don't think there is a state senator in this country who could probably put that kind of talk together. So I want to congratulate you, sir, on all that's happened. It is Ken's old boss, Ian Bowles, used to talk a lot about this competition with California, and it's amazing how you've been able to jet right by. And I'm very proud, actually, to be in this regional office in this state where this kind of activity is happening. And as someone who looks at all the states in New England, I can tell you they're all looking at what you're doing and they're trying to catch up. They like to talk about their differences and how they're doing something this way, that way better. But the fact is, Massachusetts is bringing the whole region forward, which has typically been the case over the years. So congratulations. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a special pleasure also to be here with Ken. For years, I've worked with Ken in his roles, two roles over at Massachusetts, but most recently as Commissioner of DEP. And I'm very proud of the things we've been able to do and the kind of relationship we've had over that time. And I need to tell you that as all those things were listed, I leaned over to Ken. I said, Ken, what role did you have in it? And he says, well, I wrote some of them. And my point is that we now have a leader amongst us who's now stepped out on the national level to lead the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I'm very honored to be here. I think our order is right. I think the senator and I are sort of talking about what is. Ken could talk about, as a good advocate will, as I used to. Ken will talk about where we need to go, which I think is entirely appropriate. I also want to thank Dan Moon of the Environmental Business Council and others who've helped us along in all of this area. I think it was said so clearly by the senator what the economics of this is all about, and I think bringing that along is really, really important. So if I push the right button, which button is it? The red? The right one? There we go. So I make the point initially of putting the president up there for an important reason. He is the first president to step out and actually push mitigation policy on climate change. I think we sometimes in our era where presidencies tend to wear out over time, over the 8-year period, forget the kind of leadership that this president has shown on this issue. So we all know that this region, the work that was just described here in Massachusetts, is part of the reason he's been able to do that. We are now in a very important place. So what I'm going to talk about today is what he's asked me to do, essentially. And I think Gina McCarthy would say the same thing, the administrator of EPA. We're marching out on climate change at EPA on multiple levels because of the leadership of this president. And as I've learned very, very much firsthand, I may be a regional administrator, but the way the federal government works, it really is the case that the White House, the Office of Management Budget, the Council for Environmental Quality, the leadership at EPA, the leadership at NOAA, the leadership at DOI, all these parties work together because one person directs or puts that energy behind it happening. Otherwise, it does not happen. So I want you all to be very clear about what's going on right now. What we're talking about in terms of mitigation, the Clean Power Rule, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, is really a personal commitment he's made in the face of withering attacks on this issue. A lot of people in the second term might have just said, well, I've done a few things, I've ended a war, I've saved the economy, I've saved the auto industry. Despite the criticism, I can leave this job knowing history will treat me well. But he didn't. He stood up and said, I'm going to do something about this problem, much to the point that Senator Pacheco made. We can't wait. Game on. We have to get going. So, moving forward, what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the Clean Power Rule initially. And Senator Pacheco hit some of the very highest points. Hopefully, I'll give you a little more depth. But first, we have to define what we are working with. It starts with the Clean Air Act and only the Clean Air Act. We all wish Congress had moved a climate bill forward, followed the lead of states like Massachusetts and California and numerous other states, but they have not. And at this point, there's really no prospect for something happening. Now, my good friend Senator Whitehouse is always thinking about how it could happen. I know Senator Whitehouse is a great friend of Sea Grant and continues to do so, and he plans to make sure that our coastal issues that are being defined here in the climate issue will be followed. But the bottom line is we are right now trying to regulate, and where's that little pointer? There it is. I'll point out that is it working? Oh, let's see. How does one make this work? Well, never mind. I've circled it up there. We are regulating in what's the electricity generation sector, or what we call EGUs, electricity generating units. This is the sector we can attack with the Clean Air Act with this Clean Power Rule. And it speaks to essentially the fact that this is not something that's going to solve the problem of climate change, but it certainly will try to coax the rest of the country to get on the path that New England is already on and California is already on, or some of our more progressive states are already on. Nationwide, and it was referred to by Senator Pacheco, nationwide, with this rule, we will cut emissions in the power sector to 30% cut it by 30% from 2005 levels. Now, a lot of us have asked us, well, is that a baseline? What's that mean? And it's really just a guiding point. It's kind of the way the world is thinking about carbon emissions. They're using that year 2005 as a beginning to talk about the issue. But I want to make it very clear, this isn't a baseline. It's not in the statute. It's not in the rule specifically. We're doing 2005. But it gives us a reference point to speak about. We'll start making significant reductions in 2020 when the rule is implemented. In the proposed rule for states, CO2 emissions will be reduced because we'll give each state a goal, a direction as to what we think they can do. How do we set that goal? Well, that's a bit of magic science. But the bottom line is each state is in a different place on its capability to reduce carbon emissions. They will also, and each state has a toolbox of sorts, a building block, looking at what all states have done. And I want to be very clear about this. This plan was generated because of intensive, continual conversation with states. I don't know how many meetings Ken Kimmel went to as commissioner, but there were a lot more than I did. And that, I think that speaks to something and how, with regard to how this rule was developed. We dug into the experience and the efforts that people like Senator Pacheco and Ken Kimmel actually created and asked, well, how do we move that kind of work across the country? How do we make this authority work to that end? So we came to the fact that there are these building blocks of action that states can follow. And if you look at them, you start at number one, make fossil fuel plants more efficient. So any state, the most non-acting state in the country, could probably make their power plants more efficient. Even coal-burning states, they can make those coal plants work better. So we start with that point. We can move then to using lower emitting power sources. So if you're like, let's say, Ohio, and you produce 75% of your electricity with coal, you could begin to move to cleaner sources, such as natural gas. Now, we need to remember they're nowhere near where we are in this conversation. So we need to get them moving forward. So that's a next step. Third, we can build zero or low emitting sources. We just talked about all the offshore wind that may come to New England. Those are low or zero emitting sources. So that's the push towards renewables. And then finally, efficiency. What is usually the best bang for the buck in this game is they can initiate programs like renewable portfolio standards and all the other things that are in place in New England. They can start putting those in place. But I want to make it very clear, most states don't have all the building blocks. I love this slide because it gives you the same sense that the renewable portfolio slide that the senator showed. It really makes the point. You look at where those programs really are. Look at the load of programs in the east and the load of the programs in the west and the paucity of dots in the middle. So we do essentially have a very different case across the country when it comes to putting those building blocks in place. I mean, programs like RGGI, Renewable Portfolio Standards, all these things essentially make New England and the West marathon runners. That they've been preparing, they're in shape. They could run the first 3 miles of this effort without even breathing hard. But if you take my analogy forward and you take one of those states, pick one that has nothing, Nevada. They start to try to run on this, they're going to get winded quite early. And that's a principle you need to think about as we go forward in the rule. Some states can get that reduction easily, and some states can get the reduction. It's going to be hard. So the rule has been set up to accommodate that. But the bottom line, though, and I think the senator's data is probably even better than this graph, what you see there is the fact that New England's experience suggests that doing this doesn't, in fact, hurt your GDP. Your GDP still grows. You see there the carbon emissions going down while GDP is going up. Now, we can all debate relative growth rates and what they might have been. But I think the senator's data speaks more to the fact that a lot of jobs got created. I think we would argue in this part of the world that the GDP might even be lower if we didn't do the work on reducing carbon emissions. But the bottom line is you can go forward and have this positive economic benefit. Now, going back to my donut here, which I love the donut because it helps people understand the big picture. The Obama administration, before we even got to the idea of addressing loadings from EGUs, we were working on how do we deal with the transportation sector. That's another very big piece. And I think we go back to the president, and I don't want to put his picture up again, that would be a little much. But the bottom line is we've been doing things on the transportation sector since he came into office. One of the great benefits of what happened with the auto industry is a relationship was built and a joint understanding of how we can move forward in reducing emissions from vehicles. And there's been a bunch of policy over those years, but the bottom line is more rules are coming forward. This speaks to it very clearly. By raising fuel standards, we've been able to reduce carbon emissions across the fleet very effectively. It saves money. I think one of the common points between this policy and the policy regarding the Clean Power Rule is what efficiency will bring in terms of the cost to the consumer. Now, in New England, because we are the marathon runner, we're ready to run this race. We're going to see benefits to the average homeowner and the average car owner quicker. States that haven't prepared to run this race, their energy costs are going to go up a bit while they go ahead and put in the toolbox to reduce that and get that investment into efficiency. But our expectation is that over the time, by 2030, the cost of energy will actually be reduced, as will the cost of cars, operating costs of cars be reduced. And there's a distinction I just tripped on there. If you go in to buy it at the dealer, your front-end cost, it may be higher. But over time, because your operating costs are lower, you will save money on that car. I just heard an ad the other day. Those people at Toyota are pretty good. You know, the Priuses which are still sort of the standard that people think about when they think about energy efficient cars. Reliability is super high. The cars are lasting decades, literally. I think the figure was 19 out of 20 cars are still on the road after 10 years. I mean, that's the kind of cost savings we're going to see. And it also speaks to changing the public's mind about sustainability. We're buying things that are going to last. That's something that has to happen in this whole conversation as we go forward. The mindset that we have to think about the generations ahead, just as the Senator was speaking about, and in our purchases and the kind of things we do. And so that's very, very important. So that is the highest level conversation about the Clean Power Rule. We can take questions going forward. But I also want to talk a bit about the leadership we're trying to show on adaptation and resiliency. This is something, when I came to the job, and I want to say I had the great opportunity, I hope everyone does, to take a pause between my time at Save the Bay and coming to EPA service. And it was during that time I started to get into the notion of resiliency and worked with something called the Resiliency Futures Network. And this is a group of people who are aligned across the world talking about resiliency and understanding that our systems, all our systems, our financial systems, healthcare systems, all our systems are stretched very, very tight, and that resiliency has not been something we've valued going forward in the way we've developed our communities and our country. So now we need to make a change and really bring resiliency into this. And it's been very exciting to see in a very short time, in just a couple of years, a sea change in thinking, and to a point where we now have executive orders on it, we have legislation on it, we're seeing leadership all over the country on resiliency. So we've been who we are, and that is Region 1 EPA, always trying to step out and lead in our world of regional offices. We've tried to step out on resiliency and do our very best. Now, we've done it, and I'm very proud to say, and if my good colleague Mal Cote was here, he'd make me say, we've done it because we've worked in collaboration with federal partners. Consistently. This is an ethic that's in the EPA New England office, and I must tell you, it's not everywhere. And I need to credit all of you who've been in the trenches for years and years working with EPA staff on these kinds of things. We have 16 agencies who are already partnered on these kinds of issues. And as it turns out, the coastal zone is where these issues are very salient and meaningful right now. Secondly, we are working through our states through a wide range of partnerships, including the Northeast Regional Ocean Council. You should all know that this ocean policy that came forth from CEQ and the White House a couple of years ago in the first term was very controversial. And in fact, I think they've tried to pass laws in Congress to stop a national ocean policy. Can you imagine that? They want to stop planning and thinking about how we use our oceans in a way to benefit our country. That's mind-boggling. But the bottom line is, in New England, this went forward with full energy and in a very robust way. And in fact, money followed it, and it's been able to be pursued. And a lot of what you see regarding ocean management is because of federal, state coordination around ocean policy. The Gulf of Maine Council is another good example. That's actually led by states and provinces that we've been part of over the years, that others have been part of. We have our interstate organizations, the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, which leverages resources, and we've been able to start leveraging resources through NUIPIC to begin to move forward on adaptation. The Northeast Sea Grant Consortium is something we're proud to be participating in and to begin to work on adaptation and resilience. And of course, we have 3 quasi sort of non-governmental organizations that have formal relationships with NROC. These memorandums of understanding move forward so we can do things like the coastal and ocean observing systems. One of the problems in dealing with adaptation and resilience is you've got to have more data. You've got to be able to start to get data off the system as you see it change and analyze it and bring it to people in ways they can understand it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But that's a huge problem, especially for people who are working at the state level, and most challenging for people who work at the local level. They are the group that's going to feel this pain more than any group in this country. As the senator was talking about the tough choices that states are going to have to be made, they're even tougher at the local level as they have to deal with adaptation and resiliency issues. So one of the tools that we have in place that we've got is, what happened to my slide on the, is the need for what we call our climate-ready estuary effort. These are two flagship programs. It did come up, somehow it got out of the slide order. These climate-ready estuaries programs is another collaboration where we've taken the Office of Water and competed for funds to get coastal communities ready through our estuary programs. We've done more here in New England than anywhere else. We've had 10 projects in New England. The money is too small, way too small. But we've been able to show through the efforts to climate-ready estuaries how you need to adapt your community, especially when it comes to managing water from wherever it comes. So size of culverts, the kinds of flushing you need in your marshes, all the things you need to sustain your programs is very important. And I know Sea Grant has been a long and generous partner in that. But as we go forward, our programs are still too small. And the fact is that there are federal efforts that are going on in different places across all the federal agencies that touch local government. And there's a lot of them. And one of them that has not been a traditional partner but is becoming a frequent partner is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. You should all be aware that a lot of money has flowed through HUD in the Sandy relief effort. The $1 billion that the president talks about for adaptation is going to flow through HUD. So those of us in the environmental side have begun to understand, there's the old adage, you need to go where the money is. We've begun to understand that we need to build partners, really deep partnerships, not just with NOAA, who we're aligned with on our missions, but agencies who we have not formally seen ourselves as fully aligned with. And over my time, we've been able to build a deep partnership with HUD to move things forward. So out of that relationship, we moved to, that darn slide won't go away, I'm sorry. We were asked, in terms of doing all that, to respond to an executive order on climate adaptation. And this is just a fact base for how this will work going forward. And we just completed it last week, actually. I signed the final adaptation plan for this region. Every region did one, and it's all rolled up into a national agency plan. We've looked at every policy, every law, every piece of what we do, and asked questions about adaptation and the issues they're going to bring going forward. And this gets reflected in things like what is our policy when it comes to making state revolving loan fund allocations? Do we ask for resiliency analysis in terms of how those monies are going to be spent? All the wastewater infrastructure has to get looked at. We have to encourage communities to do that. We have to do the same thing when it comes to drinking water systems. These are huge issues. And again, it falls on our local partners as we look at it. Another good example is our hazardous waste, our cleanup programs. Massive problem when you think about it. There's a lot of Superfund sites right on rivers and right on the coast. The investments are in the billions and billions of dollars in terms of cleaning up these sites. We have to secure these in the face of climate change and adaptation challenges. So we have our own problems, but again, those get extended to local government. How do we work with local government to deal with those? And finally, the brownfields program is a good example. We've got to deal with how brownfields need to be adapted and cleaned up in the context of climate. So with all of that going on, and I think you've heard my message over and over again about local government, we decided that we needed to do a climate leaders summit to really bring local government leaders together and ask the question of how does the system have to change for your benefit? The system you know us as is. You know, all these separate agencies delivering grant money, delivering tools, delivering analysis, actually delivering enforcement and regulation and all kinds of things. If you're a local government person, your relationship with federal government can be very complicated. to say the least. So we asked local government to come together, and I also want to thank Ken and his colleagues. This was done in partnership with our state commissioners, and we had a conversation, a day-long conversation about what needs to change to make sure adaptation and resiliency is something they can actually do. And it was a conversation at the systemic level. We didn't talk about specific grant monies or specific programs. We said, well, what do you need to actually do this? Because there's, to this point, with the exception of some notable great case studies, a lot of governments have jumped into this and they freeze up. They go, oh my God, what are we going to do? I think of the communities near Senator Pacheco's district, Fall River, New Bedford, in my world, Bridgeport. These are not prosperous places. These are places that are still struggling from the economic dislocation that's gone on for the last 50 years and the erosion of the manufacturing economy. And now they're faced with the fact that their cities may be underwater in 50 years. That's a big problem. I come from Rhode Island. The problem in Rhode Island is almost too big to describe because of the richness of our coastal communities. That's where the value in the state is. So we needed to have a conversation that talked about how systemically we can begin to raise those conversations in the right way. What's happened is we have formed now 6 task forces to talk about these issues. They're going to address issues like data, models, analysis, communication. How do you talk to your community about it? How can the federal government pull this data together in a more constructive way? How can state and federal governments work together in a more positive way? So we're working forward with that. It should be an important effort. And if that wasn't enough, whoops, went away. Our task force, the president actually commissioned a national task force to address the same question and asked Governor Shumlin to be part of that. So we look forward to that coming together in the next, this fall is when the national task force will come together on how we can better serve local government. We are pleased that as a region, we are stepping out and leading on that. And I thank you for your time as we go forward.